So we're going to get started right away here with Matthew Brown from the University of Texas at Austin, and he will be presenting on fossil preparation and conservation at the University of Texas at Austin, 1935 to 2009.
Well, it's good to see you all. Welcome back from the break. I'm here to talk about the history of fossil preparation at UT, but also kind of the context for why the history of our laboratory methods is important. So the preparation is obviously almost always a prerequisite for doing any kind of study on vertebrate fossils. Some fossils don't need much preparation. It could include just washing sediment off, but there's usually some kind of human interaction that takes place with the specimens. And something that is not as widely acknowledged is that at this stage, we have a great potential to shape the anatomy of a specimen. So people interacting with fossils can result in some anthropogenic artifacts that could easily be confused for a natural product of preservation or the life history of an animal. Click. And in general, the field of paleontology doesn't have a very good understanding of how laboratory methods have evolved through time and why we do what we do now and what we've done in the past. So we tend to treat objects in collections as if they just kind of appeared on a shelf and that we can go study those and develop these great insights about evolution, about ecology, without really knowing much about the very basic method of understanding those specimens as in part as artifacts. When I got to Texas and started renovating the labs, we were going through a lot of historical documentation, found that there was a lot of information that surprised me in our archives that is kind of buried and not really available. So some deep reading of some of the field notes and laboratory records and handbooks from some of the past projects have been really enlightening in this regard. And one of the things that it led me to find was that the Works Progress Administration was a huge impetus for starting the paleontology program at UT, especially the vertebrate paleo program as we know it today. So as Angie was talking about this morning, there's a long history at UT. We've got over 125 years worth of collections represented in our collection. One example of that is the Dumble Survey, where the Texas Geological Survey was doing mapping across the state, collecting fossils. The guy here on the mule is a geologist who was reported to travel the state with a geology, Lyell's Principles of Geology in one saddlebag and the Bible in the other. He was a preacher, and so when he was not collecting fossils, he was proselytizing. And then specimens that he collected were sent to Cope for description, so we've got a lot of type material that was described by Cope and ended up back in our collections. So all of that material, in some respect, probably went through some kind of preparation. But the first record that we actually have of a preparation program was centered around the Texas Centennial Exposition in 1936. And so this is the gymnasium on the UT campus where fossils were exhibited from around the state as they'd been collected so far and held in the Bureau of Economic Geology. But they didn't have a big facility. They wanted a mounted dinosaur for this exhibit, so they traded some specimens with the American Museum of Natural History that were collected in these boxes here, are printed 1902 and 1903. These are when these were excavated, traded from New York to Texas, but then they opened the crates and found they were still in the field jackets. So they didn't have any mechanism by which to prepare and mount these. So they've still been in the field jackets in the original crates in our basement since then. So there's a Camarasaur in there. If anybody wants to come prep it, we can mount it. But so at the same time, the United States and much of the world was undergoing a Great Depression. In the U.S., one of FDR's plans to alleviate the Depression was the various New Deal projects for work relief. One of those that we're interested in is the Works Progress Administration, which and changed at some point to the Works Projects Administration. So they built playgrounds, dams, roads, airports, apparently mosquito abatement, and et cetera. And that's the part that interests us today, is one of those projects in the state of Texas was the statewide Paleontological Mineralogic Survey, These surveys also took place in Oklahoma, Nebraska, Colorado, but of course it's Texas, so this was the biggest. It was directed by E.H. Sellards, who was the director of the BEG at the time. And during that period, between 1939 and 1941, they collected thousands, tens of thousands of specimens from the majority of the counties in Texas. They built preparation labs to process these specimens, and they spent about $250,000 and employed hundreds of people to work throughout the state conducting these surveys. So they built their first preparation lab in San Antonio, which is about 75 miles or so south of Austin, which accommodated 10 preparators. It was a big lab, but they closed it after 3 months because it was too small. And because prepared specimens were being damaged, being moved between the lab in San Antonio and the lab, the collection space in Austin. So they decided, well, let's just put the lab next to the collection so that way we minimize the risk of damage due to transport. So they moved to Austin after just a few months. So this was still in 1939. They built the lab on a small campus, just, well, it's now incorporated into the main campus due to growth, but this is kind of the southeast corner of campus as we know it today. And they built a 25-foot by 50-foot and a 25-foot by 30-foot lab to accommodate 30 preparators. And if you can believe it, that wasn't enough. They hired 50 preparators and built an even bigger workspace. Another 50-foot by 75-foot lab. So that's about 6,000 square feet, almost 6,000 square feet of lab space with 50 preparators working. The average number of preparators during this project was 30. That comes from the final report at the end of this project in 1942. So here's one photo of the lab in action. During this time, or during this photo, we can see at least parts of 13 preparators all working at once here. So they were really busy. They were very productive. And looking through some of the government reports around this project, they discussed staffing the lab was very difficult. Finding all of the workers were coming from the general relief roles of unemployed people throughout the state. So it certainly wasn't a technically trained population. Of course, that's been a problem in paleontology prep ever since its inception. Adam Herman talks about it in his 1909 paper. Camp and Hanna talk about it in their Methods in Paleontology book from the late 30s. William Diller Matthews talks about it when he, in his biography of Herman. So what the WPA did was create a training manual for both field and laboratory methods. So it's about a 150-page document that, and about 50 of those pages discuss laboratory techniques. And a big part of what they did was standardize toolkits. So every worker coming into the lab was issued a toolkit. They were required to document all the time spent working on because it was a federal project, they were really good at record keeping. So we actually have some records, and some of the very first records of kind of an institutionalized lab documentation process. People in the past have talked a lot about documenting locality data, keeping that data associated with specimens in the collections, but as far as I've found, until this point, nobody has recommended that you keep records about who was preparing specimens and what they were doing. And then they also, in order to keep people engaged and interested, they would have brown bag lunches where paleontologists on the project would come in and explain to the people why they were working on what they had found and what they were doing and why it was important. So they were keeping people engaged that way and constantly doing training throughout this process. So this is an example of their standard toolkit. In their lab methods handbook, they followed Adam Herman. They used a lot of his recommendations, and then the new at the time Camp and Hanna Methods in Paleo book. So you saw this slide yesterday. This was actually a drawer that I opened when I got here. Well, it didn't look like that when I got to Texas, but I laid all these out and recreated this photo. But we still use these tools today in the lab. These are very handy tools for preparation. I use the same hammer and chisel that these guys were using in the 1940s on some of the more challenging specimens that we've got from various localities. Another thing that these folks did, this is the skull of a specimen called the Onion Creek mosasaur. This is a giant glyptodon carapace that's being reconstructed. These things immediately went into the Texas Memorial Museum as it was being built. And so these have been on public display continually since that time. So these, you know, the contributions that these workers were making were really serving as a foundation for the museum and collections that that we're working with now. So in 1941, at the end of the year, everybody suddenly had something better to do. Nobody was preparing fossils anymore, and they were all being sent off to Europe or the Pacific. But the few workers who remained, there were 2 or 3 preparators who stayed on and continued through the founding of the Vertebrate Paleontology Lab, as it's called now. That's the name of our facility. This is the building that they did the first fossil preparation in. And, you can see part of Angie's building on the far right side behind that tree. But this is a concrete materials testing facility now. But that was their first prep lab as part of VPL. Then this is a photo of the lab in 1958. So Jack Wilson was the founder of the lab. And Lansing Craig was a preparator who worked through most of the late 40s and through the 50s and then mid 60s. And when he retired, and so this is Lansing Craig again working with some of those same hammers and chisels, very, you know, familiar old glue bottles. He's using this microscope and an air scribe. This picture was taken in the early 50s. You know, it wasn't until I started doing research on this kind of thing that that I discovered, even though it's, you know, in the published literature, it's in Science, and all these people have cited it since then, that Elmer Riggs was the first one to modify an air scribe for use in paleo in 1903. So these are tools that have been with us for a very long time, but we have kind of a generational turnover where every generation thinks that they've innovated something that in fact we've been using for well over 100 years. And we see that in the literature in the 40s and the 60s, people talking about these new developments of pneumatic tools, but in fact that's kind of always been the practice, at least in modern times. So in the 60s, the lab was renovated and 2 preparators were added, Earl Yarmer and Bob Rainey. Earl Yarmer is the son of Joseph Yarmer, who was the chief preparator at the Carnegie Museum. He was also the grandson of Arthur Coggeshall, who was the chief preparator at the Carnegie. You can see Coggeshall here seated in the vest with his legs crossed in Paris, where he traveled the world mounting Diplodocus. So Earl came from that legacy. Bob Rainey is preparing this holotype of this early primate from the Big Bend. Bob came from Princeton, where he made a name for himself preparing specimens like this Green River bat. When Chuck Schaff was awarded the Morris Skinner Award, he credited Bob for training him almost everything he knows about vertebrate paleontology techniques, and that his field methods were what Chuck had trained people with all through his career. So Bob had a reputation for training. He was responsible for training Bill Amaral, who had a famous career at Harvard, Kyle Davies, who's the chief preparator at Oklahoma, Ron Tykowski, who went on to be the chief preparator at the Perot Museum, the Dallas Museum of Natural History that's now the Perot Museum. Sebastian Egberts was one of the last students that Bob worked with, who went on to be the chief preparator at Ohio. So Bob retired and then passed away shortly after in early 2009, and I was hired to come in and take over the lab. He'd been sick for several years, so the lab had, because he wasn't there, had fallen into disrepair, because even though it didn't have a preparator, there were still a bunch of students working there, visiting researchers coming, and specimens being broken and stacking up in the lab. So we went from a facility that looked like this in the 1950s through the 60s and 70s. This is what it looked like when I arrived. That's essentially the same view, just from a different elevation. And so we gutted and renovated the lab, and this is what it looks like now. We've incorporated digital techniques using CT scanning side by side with the specimens in the lab, so that we can view the specimens you know, with X-ray vision of sorts. We've also designed this as a training facility, because we have so many graduate students in our program coming through that we've got about 20 grad students in vert paleo alone. And they all have a laboratory methods component of their training. So we look at the way the history of preparation has shaped what we're doing now, that the treatments like we saw in Angie's talk this morning, the treatments that have been applied to specimens have stay with those specimens in perpetuity, essentially. There's some record, there's some impact that that has been made upon the specimens by these processes. And you could sum it up by saying like preparation is forever or something like that. But in taxonomy, some workers have coined a four-dimensional species concept, talking about how a lineage, as species are speciating and evolving, what happens to a specimen between being, or to an organism between being, species A and splitting out to species B and C. There's this period of transition where these things are changing, but we don't really know what to call them in that middle point. Well, I argue that the specimens are also changing. We've got a four-dimensional specimen concept where the specimens, as they've been described in the 1800s or the 1900s or now, are not going to be the same thing that people are looking at 100 or 200 years from now. So, so having this historical record is critical to our further understanding of how not just our ideas about conservation issues and preparation issues, but our ideas about the actual anatomy and taxonomy of these animals, how these things change as characters change, maybe through errors in preparation or materials failures that we now no longer have the exemplar of what that anatomical argument might have been. So then it was interesting for me going through these records and seeing how these past programs have this big legacy, and that one of the things that dang it, I just lost that train of thought. So the that's the SVP bulletins are a gold mine for this. So you've got institutional archives. You can go through records. You can dig through government records. You can find information here and there in the literature that talks about specific prep methods. But I found just in the last few weeks that going through the last 70 years or so as the SVP bulletins, there's a lot of information about what specimens had been prepared in at various institutions. People would write in and say, hey, we just prepared this. And they'll often tell you what preparator was doing the work. And so if you're looking for information about your own institution, that is a good place to go that most people, now that SVP bulletins are online, should be easier to find. And most of us have a shelf full of them somewhere in the institution. So go dig through that stuff. So there are always a slew of people to acknowledge in these kinds of talks, but I really wanted to focus on dedicating this talk to Dr. Wann Langston, who passed away about 2 weeks ago. And until about 3 or 4 months ago, was still coming out to the vertebrate paleontology lab on a essentially weekly basis. And Wann is is one of the most famous names in 20th century vertebrate paleontology. Huge impact on Texas paleontology, Canadian paleontology. He was the curator of vert paleo at the National Museum in Ottawa in the mid-50s through early 60s. What a lot of people don't know is that Wann was actually a preparator for most of his career. He went in the field for the first time when he was 17 years old with Don Savage and William McAnulty from Oklahoma. Wann was responsible for the panel mounting of Dilophosaurus at Berkeley when he was a graduate student there. He was the chief preparator at Berkeley for between like 1948 and 1954 while he was working on his PhD. And being able to talk to Wann about the history of paleontology and the history of preparation, he met people like Barnum Brown when he was a kid. He knew a lot of these staff at places like the American Museum, the Field Museum. So, part of these historical records that we need access to are being lost when people like Wann pass away. So that's another resource that often goes untapped. To talk to the people who are in your institution and have that institutional knowledge. So I'd like to say thanks to everybody who's here, and if we could get a round of applause for the Tyrrell too, who are doing a fantastic job. You got time? Okay.